This is Edwin Richards doing the CS 499 Milestone 1 code review. So first I'm going to start by demonstrating the project. This is the SNHU authentication and authorization system that was written for IT 145. I chose to do mine in a graphical user interface rather than just the simple console. It seems to be a little more my speed. So the application just begins by displaying a login screen and username, or the prompting for the username and password. So the user types in a username and the password. Let me make sure I spell it right. Once the username and password has been entered, the user just clicks this login button, at which time the authentication is processed. Looks like I have misspelled something. Oh yeah, I did the wrong password. There we go. Okay, so once you log in, the program greets the user with their current role, and then also displays their authorized tasks, which is pulled from a separate file based upon the role of the user. On this screen, they have the option to either exit the program or log out. So I will log out, at which point it returns back to the original login screen. And this allows another user to log in if they want to. Now I'm just going to demonstrate what happens when the user cannot authenticate. So I will just enter an invalid password. It should allow me to do this 3 times, at which point the program will close. So here it is, maximum login attempts have been exceeded, the program will close, and there it is, program is done. So that's how the program works. Now let's dive in and look at the code. So this is the SNHU authentication UI.java. This is the main class for this Java. It is written in Java. I intend to convert this to C# using another graphical user interface technology called WPF, or Windows Presentation Foundation, also utilizing a modern design pattern called MVVM, which is the model view model design pattern. So here the program begins in the main method, of course. Most of this is all just auto-generated because it's a graphical user interface application that I developed within NetBeans IDE. And so most of this, I didn't actually touch any of this. It just generated all of this for me. But the main thing here is that once the setup has been done, then Java calls this constructor to create this user interface. And this is actually defined at the top here. So that's the constructor. Inside the constructor for my user interface, I defined several private variables, which will be used throughout the application. Or that's the class, the member variables. Inside the constructor is where first it generates initializes everything to be able to be displayed on the screen in the graphical user interface. And then I initialize my variables, my member variables. And then upon construction of the class, what I do is I go out and look for the credentials file. The credentials file is the one that contains all the usernames and passwords that are valid for the system. So first what I do is I open that up and begin reading it. Let me show you what the file actually looks like. So I've got the credentials.txt. So here's how the file is structured. It has the username as the first field, followed by a tab, and then the MD5 hash of the password, which is the second field, and then again followed by a tab. And then this field is just the plain text password, which is used mostly for testing purposes, and so we were able to determine how to get to this hash. But this is ignored by my program. And then finally, the last field in the line is the role of the user. So this user, griffin.keys, is assigned the role of zookeeper and has certain permissions afforded to them. Same thing here for these additional users. They have different roles. A total of 3 separate roles and 6 different users. So here's what happens when the program begins, or the class is initialized. I open up the credentials.txt file. Then I begin to scan it. So as long as there is still data within the file, I am doing this, this loop here. First thing I do is I create a credential object, which I have defined in the credential class. Let me look at that real quick here. The credential object, the class has 3 member variables, including the username, the MD5 password, which will be the hash instead of the plain text, which is never stored in my program for security reasons. And then the value of the role. And role is also another object, another class. So let's look at that one real quick too. The role itself has 3 values: the name, the greeting, and the authorized tasks, all strings. And then this is really just the plain old Java object, POJO, which just has some getters and setters for those members. Within the credential class, it's also very simple. It's just a bunch of getters and setters. And then also I do have a member method called validate password, and that takes a single string parameter, which is then compared to the valid MD5 password hash and compared to see if it is the same. If it is, it returns true. If not, returns false. And that's what I will use in order to determine if the user has entered the valid username and password. So that reads everything in. Right here at tokens, we split on the, so first I get the full line and then I split on any white space. So let's look at the credentials again. And that's just because each field that I care about really doesn't have any spaces in it. Some of the plain text passwords do, but that's okay because like I said, I ignore that. But I'm splitting on the tabs or any white space. So I get a field here. The first position is the username. Second position is going to be the hash that I care about. And then the last position, whether it's 4 or 5, is the role of the user. So first I set the username and the password, and then I get the role, right, because I created a role object, and I set that to the last element, either 4 or 5, because if there's a space in the password, this will split this up as on here as well. So really I just care about the last. So what I need to do is get just the last element by using the length -1. So I set the name and I set the role for this credential. And then what I do is I add my credential object, which has the username and password and the role supplied to it. I add that to my array list called valid credentials. Once that is finished, then the view, the user interface is displayed, and that's where it will show the prompts for the username and password, the text fields. Since it's a user interface application, it is event driven. So the next thing that should happen is when, after the user has typed in their username and password, they will click the button to log in. This is the code that will execute when that action is performed. This is the event that is fired. And inside this, excuse me, inside this, the first thing I do is create an instance of this MD5 hasher. Let's see. And then I get the username from the text box where they entered it. I get the password also. Then I clear the password out just for security reasons. Then I initialize some variables to determine whether or not I have found a valid username for the one that was entered. We increase our attempts. Here now what I'm doing is looping through each of those valid credentials that I've read in from that credentials.txt file. And we're checking to see if the username if the username matches the username that was entered. If it does, I set my flag here for the user found to true, and then I set the credential value so that I can use that later when validating the password. Once that's set, we have found one, I can go ahead and break this loop because I no longer need to continue searching through there. And then here we could continue on. If the user was found, if they have entered a valid username, then what I do is I call the validate password on the hashed value of the password that was entered. So I'm calling this MD5 hash password entered. And and let me look at that real quick. This was the MD5 digest class is one that was, the code was basically provided to us, but I put it into a class just so I could do the hashing on it. But yeah, like I said, this algorithm here was provided to us. But this is what generates the hash value based on the string text. So that's what I'm doing here is I'm hashing that using that algorithm. That's going to provide that hash. Then we pass that over to my validate password. That's what we saw in the credential class. Then that returns either true or false. If it's true, that means that the the password matched. But if it's not true, then what we do here is we check to see if we've reached the maximum number of attempts. Otherwise, we just print this, or we'll call this invalid username or password function method, which let's find that here. All it does is display a message to the user, a little dialog box that says incorrect username or password. Try again. In the event that it was validated, then let's see here. So if not, that's good. Okay, we go in here. Otherwise, once we get to this point, so what happens is we return from this. If the authentication failed, then we return from this function, and all code below that is ignored. And then when the user changes their password or adjusts the username password combination and clicks the login button again, we start again from the top and do all those steps over. In the instance that the username and password did match, they are valid, then what happens is we skip the return, and it comes down here. Once we get to this point, we know that the authentication has succeeded. So I reset the attempts back to 0 in case they log out. We want to be able to let another user have 3 full attempts. And then what I do is I display the next screen, a completely separate screen that will display the greeting and the context for the authorization portion. So we set that, we hide the current screen, that's the login screen, and then we display the new screen. So let's look at how that one is set up. So when this screen is created, we are given a role value, and let's see, and that role is the one that was attached to the username that was authenticated correctly. So now we get the file, we create some variables here for the file name, and we create this link here so that we can go back to the login screen if they log out. Now what we're doing is comparing to see if the role that was entered, if the name is equal to admin, then what we do is we set the admin.txt, that's the file that should be displayed. And let me show you what that looks like here. It's just this, the greeting, and then the context, the content of what they're allowed to view. So otherwise we do some more checks here just to see, just to set the correct file name based on the role. And honestly, this could probably be simplified a little bit. Instead of doing all this if checks, I could just set file name equal to the role.name plus txt, now that I think about it. Could reduce those 7 lines there to 1. After we have set the file name, then I create another scanner object which will open up the correct file. Then we begin reading. So first I read the first line. Okay, that's for the admin, for example. Read that first line. That's going to be the greeting portion. So we set the greeting to the line red, and then we skip any white space. That will get rid of that blank line, as you can see right here, and that's in all of these different ones. The zookeeper, admin, and veterinarian all have this blank line on line 2. So that skip allows us to consume that and basically just skip that line. Then I read the next line, and that's going to be the actual tasks, right? The authorized tasks. So I set that into my role as well. And then I can locate the label on the view on this user interface, the label for the greeting, and we set its text to the greeting value of the role. And then we do the same thing for the authorized tasks, set its value based on the role as well. And that's it. So that's pretty much all that's necessary for the authorization portion. And then there is an action or an event handler right here for the logout. If the user clicks logout, then first thing we do is we set the login screen back to visible, and then we close this current the authorization screen, the one that displays the greeting and their authorized tasks. So, and then there's also an event to handle if they close from that screen. It just closes instead of displaying the login screen. So that's pretty much the extent of the application. Some changes. I know I mentioned earlier that I intend to convert this into C# using another graphical user interface and some modern design patterns. Another thing that I will change is in the hashing. So this one is done using this MD5 digest, the MD5 hashing algorithm, and I intend to change that to the SHA-256, I think SHA, I don't know how it's pronounced, but the SHA-256, which is a much more secure hashing algorithm. And additionally, instead of containing all the values here in all the valid credentials in a plain text file like this, I intend to store this in a database so that there's a little bit more security and this file is not just sitting on a machine somewhere waiting for somebody to open it up and have access to all of the usernames and passwords. Additionally, I'll probably have these values for the roles and their capabilities, their authorized tasks. I think I'll have those in the database as well. I don't want to read anything out of just standard text files just because of the reduced security. So yeah, those are that's the code that I have at the moment, and those are the enhancements that I intend to make for the final challenge.